Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. As usual, there are a lot of things I'd like to cover, so let's go ahead and take a look at our first item. Blue Secret Medicine, a liquid medicine used by high-ranking healing church doctors in strange experiments. It is a type of psychoanesthesia that numbs the brain. But hunters, maintaining consciousness by means of dying will, employ only its side effect. That is, stop all movement and it will thin one's very existence. So, as usual, there are a number of interesting translation choices on display here, but the one that stands out the most to me is the distinction in how hunters are described as resisting the mind-numbing effects of this medicine. Notably, the term used in the Japanese involves a familiar pun. Hunters are said to maintain consciousness by means of ishi, which is pronounced in the same way as the word for will, but uses the characters for bequest and will or intention. This is exactly the same representation as is used in the Japanese term for blood echoes, or chinoishi, which you will perhaps recall I've mentioned could be more literally translated as dying will of blood. This is why my more literal translation is phrased to say that hunters maintain consciousness by means of dying will. Remember, though, the characters in use here are referencing a lingering will passed on from those who've died before, meaning that the Japanese gives a pretty strong indication that it is not the hunter's own will that allows them to maintain consciousness, but their ability to channel the will of those who've died. The official English, by contrast, seems to imply that it is the hunter's own will that is at work. You can see this in the phrasing, able to maintain consciousness by force of will. To me, this calls to mind nothing so much as the idea of doing something by sheer force of will, and so conveys a sense of self-sufficiency. Having made that distinction, though, I remain intrigued at some of the ways in which I think this translation works. First, notice that it's technically not wrong. One way or another, it's by bringing to bear an unusual force of will that a hunter is able to maintain consciousness under the effects of the medicine. It's only by implication that this gets across a different idea than the Japanese. Second, consider how well it ties into the theme of riding the edge that Bloodborne seems fundamentally interested in. Hunters must be merciless, yet maintain their humanity. Insight can reveal crucial truths about the world, but only at the risk of madness. Likewise, items frequently mention effects such as intoxication and euphoria as states to be resisted. In many ways, hunters are called to maintain a high degree of control in an environment that provides countless ways for them to lose it. That they should be able to exercise their exceptional force of will to turn a mind-numbing drug to their advantage is entirely in line with these themes. So, on the one hand, this is another instance where the official English isn't getting across the idea of hunters drawing strength from dying will as clearly as the Japanese. On the other hand, it is tying in with one of the other main themes of the game while technically remaining accurate. It's an interesting choice for sure, though part of me has to wonder what the effect would be if the same solution that was settled on for blood echoes was used here. Then the line would read something like, hunters, able to retain consciousness by force of echoing will, make use of a secondary effect of the medicine, an effect which worked out quite well for us just now. But as far as other possible translations are concerned, it's always important to remember the usual caveats. There were likely specific circumstances involved that we can't know about now that influenced the way things went. Anyway, now that you've seen the Blue Elixir in action, and we've talked about what I think is the standout translation choice, let's move on to our next item. Reiterpallasch, a weapon used by the Knights of Cainhurst, a product of combining a large knight's sword with one of their unique guns. The nobles, who of old were fond of blood, were therefore close neighbors of the illness of blood, and the dispatching of beasts was one of the secret roles of their servants. By calling their servants knights, would that mean they at least have honor? So, as you probably noticed, the biggest discrepancy here appears to lie in how the final line of the item description is handled. Literally, the Japanese ends as a question, while the official English is a statement. In terms of the overall idea that's meant to come across, though, I don't think the difference here is actually all that large. The Japanese line gets across the idea that the nobles of Cainhurst called their servants knights, albeit a little indirectly, then asks whether simply calling them that lends them honor. The idea here seems to be questioning how much a title is worth. Knight is a high prestige term, while servant is a low prestige job. Can the mere form, the simple title of knight, lend honor to a position generally deemed inferior? Having established that as the main theme the Japanese is interested in getting a player to speculate about then, let's turn back to the English and see how well that same idea comes across. Here, we're directly told that the nobles called their servants knights, and did so for the sake of appearances. Who these appearances are for is left unspecified, but I think we are once again getting at the use of a hollow title to meet a social purpose that doesn't align with the typical amount of prestige associated with the role of a servant. In other words, I think this is still in line with the overall thrust of the Japanese, even if there isn't a leading question being used here to prompt the player to think along these lines. In fact, similar to the sense that I got from the official description of the Shaman Boneblade, part of me wonders whether this might have been the result of an initial set of character and line limitations that were later expanded. This is the kind of change that I might expect to see being made to save space. Of course, it's also possible that this is another case where the Japanese text got updated and the official English did not, but these sorts of things are difficult to speculate about. As usual, the main thing I'm concerned with here is the effect this discrepancy produces, and again, in this instance, I don't think it ends up being too big of one. But having just looked at a Cainhurst weapon, that reminds me, we met someone there. I think it's about time we went back to that hidden throne room and checked in on the Queen. So, the last time we were here, you were saying something about kneeling before you, but what if we don't?
Such impudence. Defiled are we, yet still queen. We shall not give audience to an ill-mannered beast.
Hey, I just wanted to talk. You're being rude.
We shall not give audience to an ill-mannered beast. Get thee gone.
I wouldn't talk that way to a hunter if I were you. Take this.
How sad this is. If only our life was so easily forfeit.
Alright, obviously there's a bit of a more melancholy tone in the official translation here, and I'd like to briefly address that. You see, there's some cut content for Annalise listed in the lore translation guide that gives a lot of context in both languages that makes it seem like she'd be happy to meet her end. Except most of those lines were removed. My theory then is that the official translation was made with this context in mind, and when the content for the game was altered, that tone suddenly became less prominent, resulting in the apparent discrepancy we've just seen. Anyway, let's just give in and kneel.
Art thou brave, or merely lacking in wit? It matters not. Our flesh is undying. Speak thy mind.
You know what? That's enough for now. I think I'm going to get back to the Nightmare Frontier. In the meantime, now that we've heard a decent amount of this character's dialogue, I'd like to take a look at the speech patterns on display and see how well the tone used in the official English fits. Before we get into the actual language of the Japanese, though, let's consider some of what we know about this character already, because unlike a lot of the other characters we've met so far, we actually have some information on this one ahead of time. Quite a while ago, while we were chatting with Alfred about the corrupted Vilebloods, he mentioned that the ruler of the Vilebloods is still alive today, which is part of why he's been looking for the path to Cainhurst Castle. He also mentioned that his master, Logarius, had to stay behind to guard us from evil. What's more, we know that the Crown of Illusions we picked up after the boss fight with Logarius was worn by the Old King, and when we entered the portion of the castle hidden under an illusion that the crown revealed, we learned that we'd entered a throne room. Basically, this is a long way of saying that the woman we've been talking to is in fact the Queen of Cainhurst and the ruler of the Vilebloods. We've also seen some evidence that she remains alive despite what appears to have been a long span of time, if the state we found Martyr Logarius in was any indication, and she herself assures us that she is undying. We also know a thing or two about Cainhurst already, notably that it had an old noble class that named their servants knights in an effort at some sort of pretension. In light of all that information, it stands to reason that the undying queen of a hierarchical society would place a strong emphasis on form, speak in a high register, and use archaic speech patterns. Having established that, let's look at the first thing she says in Japanese. As expected, the language is formal and somewhat archaic. She addresses us with the subject plus yo form of address that we've noted as a formality before, then uses first an unusual expression to say that nobody else is around, and an archaic form of although in the phrase tote to inform us that this is a throne room. She also uses a regal form of address for herself amid further archaisms. Turning to the official English then, I think it's clear that all of these features have been brilliantly preserved. Her initial address of visitor is appropriately formal and slightly jarring. The use of antiquated English in words like lieth and afore comes across as fitting and natural, and even the grammar has an archaic feel to it. Then there's the use of the royal we when she says things like kneel afore us, which is both archaic and conveys her regal form of address for herself. Overall, I think the official translation perfectly captures the relevant tone both for the Japanese and for the character here. So let's move on. Blood Relative Directory. A red leather directory of the blood relatives, those who formed a contract with Annalise, Queen of the Blood of Cainhurst. From long ago, the names of all blood relatives are recorded here. These are the hunters of blood, who seek the vile as they hunt their prey. Note, this item is for online use only. It cannot be used offline. So, there are a couple interesting uses of game-specific terminology here, with perhaps the most obvious one appearing right in the title of this item. Literally, the term in use consists of only two characters, one meaning blood and the other meaning clan. Together they form the word ketsuzoku, which rather straightforwardly means blood relative. This, then, is a record of everyone who is of the blood, so to speak. But you'll probably have noticed that the official English doesn't call this the Registry of Blood Relations, or something of that kind, but the Vileblood Register. And here I think we're seeing the result of another difficult set of translation decisions that I'd like to go into. First of all, you may recall that way back in episode 10 of Translationborne, I covered a similar instance of this term, albeit in a slightly different context. Back then, the word being used wasn't just ketsuzoku, it was kegareta ketsuzoku, and I noted that in the Japanese, an unusual kanji was being used to represent the term kegareta, one associated with ritual impurity in Shinto. In that context, it seemed like a pretty straightforward decision to choose the term Vileblood as the collective noun used to identify the members of an impure bloodline. It made all the more sense because this was a label being applied to the bloodline by one of their enemies, Alfred, who identifies himself as a hunter of those of this lineage. What starts to complicate this decision, then, is that here we're seeing a reference to the same bloodline Alfred was talking about, but without the kegareta, or vile, at the beginning. And upon first examination, this omission makes some sense. After all, why should a given lineage identify itself as vile? Except, this is where some additional context further complicates things. Going back to the description of the Vileblood Register, the other game-related term that might have caught your eye was the name of what those of this lineage seek in blood. In the official translation, these are called blood dregs, while in my more literal version, I've instead said that these hunters seek the vile, and my usage of that term is no mistake. The Japanese used for blood dreg here is actually kegare, and it employs the same unusual kanji that I noted before was a bit more culturally loaded. So this is a group of hunters who are actively seeking out filth in blood to offer to their queen. What's more, in a further set of dialogue that we'll soon be seeing from Annalise, to become one of the blood relatives, you must partake of her blood. She herself describes it as rotted, and the Japanese term here is that same kegareta. In other words, vile isn't just a label applied from the outside, it's a term that gets employed by those of the blood themselves. So pretty uniformly, both from within and from without, this particular group of blood relatives is associated with impurity. Still, why apply vile blood as a universal term when the Japanese doesn't always do so? Well, this is where I can only speculate, but I imagine it has to do with a few gameplay-related issues. For one thing, using a single term helps players make the connection between Alfred's dialogue and what they find at Cainhurst. But it's not just about the lore. Remember how the storage box in the Hunter's Dream sorts weapons into church, workshop, and Vileblood categories? That means Vileblood is also an organizational term, and one that needs to fit some presumably tight character limitations. That's probably why they use terms like R-hand and L-hand weapons in the English. What's more, since these sorting terms get used in a context that has nothing to do with the player's carefully managed understanding of the lore, they need to sound compelling in their own right, which ties into the final issue I wanted to bring up, because this term is also part of the name of one of the factions that can be used in online play. Since players also need to identify with this term, that opens up a whole different set of considerations. For instance, I think it sounds a lot cooler to say, yeah, I'm one of the Vilebloods, or I swore the Vileblood oath, than it does to say, I'm one of the relatives, or I swore the oath of blood relations. And since the Vileblood Register is literally a list of members of this faction, I think it makes perfect sense to use the term here. The larger point, though, is that sometimes finding the right term to meet several different needs at once can be challenging, which I think is a good thought to end on. Until next time, then, thanks for watching, everyone.